when I went to Chicago Workers Office.
All right, so we need to talk about environmental scanning today. And then I'm going to use some time at the end of class, get in groups and work on a group thing that we'll talk about on Thursday, and then we'll move into talking, use that as a springboard into talking about ethics as well. So one of the things that we have to do as marketers, because it's not a static discipline, right? I often think that historians are pretty lucky because if your area of expertise is, for example, the American Civil War, well, we know who won that, right? We know what the outcome of that battle or that war was, and it's not going to change very much. And so you don't have to think about how the dynamics of that are going to play out because we know what the end result is. Marketing's not like that, right? It's constantly changing. And so we have to constantly be on the lookout in this environment. And when we do this, we talked about last time, this SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats assessment. 2 of those are external, 2 of them are internal to our firm, right? So opportunities and threats come from this environment. And there are these forces out there that influence our ability to market things, right? And so there are 5 dimensions that we have to think about when we're looking at our business and thinking about where we can grow and expand and things like that. There's social, economic, and we'll talk a little bit about each of these, technological, competitive, and regulatory. And these are not necessarily isolated silos that don't interact with each other, right? Obviously, they have a great deal of interplay among these 5 forces. So as far as social goes, what are some things that are impacting us from a social level? Well, what about populations and demographics? What's happening to the American population and our demographics? What? We're more diverse than we were even 50 years ago, right? Why is that? Okay, we've had a lot of immigration, particularly from the South. Texas, I think, told you at one point in time, will go minority majority very quickly, right? That's impacting the products that are demanded, things like that. When I was growing up in Oklahoma, you didn't find a whole lot of ethnic food stuff in the grocery stores, for example, in Guthrie, right? What do all the grocery stores now carry? They carry all sorts of stuff, right? And they have large ethnic food aisles. It's not just the Hispanic population, there's also a large Asian population that's moved in, right? So we've got that. In terms of age, what's happening to our population? It's aging, all right? The baby boomers are growing older. That big generation, that was my parents' generation. Because of the economic factors facing a lot of people, we have people that are staying in the workforce longer, right? It used to be that companies offered defined benefit plans, pensions. So you went to work for, say, GM or Ford or something like that. You worked there for 20 years and you got a defined benefit. Now, most companies are going to either defined contribution plans or 401ks, 403bs, things like that you have to put in and save for your own retirement. And what does that mean? Well, that means that a lot of people are having to delay retirement because you can't live off of Social Security, right? It's one of the reasons that I wanted to come back when I got my PhD to Oklahoma, because I had a lot of years vested in the Oklahoma Teachers Retirement System, which is a defined benefit, something that a lot of you will not have. You'll have to plan for your own retirement, right? And put money away. So as people have stayed in the workforce longer, now we have, for the first time in history, we have 4 generations in the workforce. And what does that mean for you all in terms of the workforce? How are they different So what are these 4 generations? Well, there's traditionalists, right? These are probably people that are your grandparents' age, right? And how do they differ from you? A lot? How so?
Lack of reliance on technology.
They what?
They lack of reliance on technology.
Okay, a lot of them don't rely on or are not comfortable with technology, maybe.
A lot of techniques for college.
Okay, at one point in time, you could go to work in this country and achieve middle class status with not having a college education. Is that true today? In fact, one of the things that we find is that when we talk to students, a lot of them worry about whether or not there is a value in a college education, considering that it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll even achieve middle class. A lot of students are getting out of college, not in professional sales, by the way, but in a lot of these other fields, they're getting out of college and they're not able to find jobs in their fields. And so they're still working at Barnes & Noble or at Starbucks. And they're disappointed in that, because it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to achieve middle class status. What does a college education mean for you all? It means that you have a better shot at it, right, than somebody who doesn't. We know, by and large, on the whole, that people who go to college have a better shot at a higher income producing job than those that don't. One of the things, and another environmental force that's impacting this is the economy. So we've been in a recession for a lot of years, right? And that's one of the things that's impacting your ability to go out and get a job. Now we're coming out of the recession, right? And unemployment is now at about 6% on the national average, somewhere around there, which is almost full employment. They consider 5% to be full employment, because at 5% what you have is you have people that are maybe unemployed because there's between jobs or shifting jobs or changing careers. And that's something that's very different among your generation than traditionalists as well, who went to work for one company and stayed there. I'll never forget my stepfather, who was an FBI agent, was one of the most solid people I knew, one of the most responsible and solid people I knew. And his mother, I'll never forget her saying at one point in time, she said she thought he was kind of shiftless because he'd had 3 jobs. She said, you know, Jim was the first in our family to go to college. That's my stepdad. And he did it by working in the coal mines in Montana one semester and then going to college. And she said, you know, he got out and he got a teaching job. And that was a really good job. And then he went back to school and he got a master's and a PhD in chemical engineering, and he went to work for Anaconda Corporation. And that was a really good job. And she said, and then he went to work for the FBI, and we sure hope he can keep this job. And I thought that was funny, because this was somebody I thought was the most stable person I knew. And he'd switched careers 3 times in his life. You all, that's almost expected, isn't it? That you will, you're not going to stay with the same company for forever and ever until you retire, probably, right? You're going to switch careers, not just companies, but you may switch entire careers, and that's different from traditionalists. Traditionalists also focus on things like, you know, following the rules, right? So when I was in the private sector, I worked for a company called the American Education Corporation. I was an executive vice president and chief general counsel for them. And my boss, who was the CEO, was very much a traditionalist. When I went to work for the company, he was 65 years old, right? And he very much believed that you should be at work, what? You're paid for 40 hours, you need to be there for, right? From 8 to 5. And what is your generation more interested in? Huh? Yeah, you're more interested in flexible scheduling, right? Than simply putting in time. If you can get your work done in less than 8 hours, what do you want to do? Yeah, why should you be there if you can get it done in less than 8 hours, right? So you're more interested in flex schedules and things like that. So we've got traditionalists, we've got baby boomers, who are my parents' generation, right? They're getting older, they're retiring, they're requiring more resources in terms of health care, right? And so that's an economic impact on our society, right? As they are drawing out Social Security. And how many of you worry about whether or not Social Security will be there when you get to retirement age, right? George W. Bush wanted to reform Social Security and make it more privatized and allow you to control your money, right? Because it's not actuarially sound. What does Social Security rely on? It's basically a transfer of wealth, right? From young to old. As you retire, you're drawing out what younger people or people that are still in the workforce are paying, right? And so as the population ages and gets older and more people retire, it presents a problem, right, for Social Security. I think Social Security will be there. This is a result of the fact that it's a politically popular program, right? And so we will continue to find ways to make sure that it stays, because what happens as you get older? That's one of the things that's also different. How many of you are eligible to vote in here? How many of you are eligible? Almost all of you, right? So we don't have an overwhelming number of foreign nationals in here. But so you're eligible to vote. How many of you actually did go vote in the last presidential election? Okay, quite a few of you, right? But what do we know that's absolutely certain? Older people do actually go vote in larger numbers than young people. One of the things that gave the Republicans some hope in this last election was that it wasn't sort of a novelty, right? Barack Obama was running for his second term, and a lot of the younger people and a lot of the minorities didn't go to the polls in the huge numbers that they had in the first election for him, right? So they vote. And as you get older, it's absolutely certain that you'll vote, and Social Security is popular, so I think politicians will keep it around. So those economic forces. Competitive forces. Now, there are different types of competitive environments, right? What kind of a competitive environment is, for example, if you live in Edmond, how many of you live in Edmond? Almost all of you live in Edmond, right? What kind of competitive environment does Edmond Electric have? None, right? Why do they even bother advertising? Because they're a what? They're a monopoly, right? They are the electric franchise for the city of Edmond. The city of Edmond actually owns Edmond Electric. If you live outside of Edmond, what do you probably have? If you live in Oklahoma City, anybody live in Oklahoma City? OG&E. Can you simply decide that you don't want to use OG&E? Nope. Nope. It's a monopoly, right? In other areas of the economy, though, there are more competition. So, for example, gas stations. How many different gas stations are there? It's highly competitive, right? And as a result of technology, you can now figure out, can't you? Who's got the cheapest gas? There are now apps, right, that you can figure out who's got the cheapest gas. So that's a technological thing. How else is technology changing the way we compete and work in this, post-industrial economy?
Immediate gratification knowledge.
Okay, immediate gratification. You can look things up. How many of you, when somebody says something, you go to your phone and start Googling it to verify? Make sure they're not lying to you. Look at Wikipedia, which is not a good source for your paper, right, which is coming out. Although, I will tell you that academics, the #1 place that they go when they start doing research, do you know what it is? Wikipedia. Right? They don't use it, they don't cite it in their papers, but it is a good place to find sources, maybe. Right? So technology is allowing us to find this information anywhere, at any time of the day, right? On our phones. I can control the camera with the app on my phone, which is what I'm doing right now. So that's a big change, right? If I wanted to do this 10 or 15 years ago, what would I have had to have done?
Run over to the camera.
I would have had to run over to the camera or have somebody over there. controlling the camera. I can zoom in and zoom out with this technological advantage, right? So, regulatory. Now this is a big one, right? And in the United States it's different than in other places. How so? And there are forces, again social forces for example, that have influenced our regulatory environment. And I'll give you a couple examples of that. Let me find some markers. You might want to write these cases down because they are test questions for my lecture. That have impacted things. So social forces and social movements also impact the regulatory environment. Now, in the United States, we have a federal system, which is different. And when you start a business, you have to think about these things. And businesses that come over to the United States, foreign companies, like British Petroleum, for example, have a different regulatory environment that they face in the U.S. than maybe in other places that have unitary systems. So there are three basic structures of government that you can have with regard to subunits of government and lower levels. At one end of the spectrum, you can have a unitary system. Most of the world has this kind of system, a unitary system, in which all power is held by the national government, and whatever powers it gives to subunits of government, which may be called provinces or states or whatever in other places, derives from that national government. At the other end of the spectrum, you can have a confederation. And a confederation is basically a loose association, and all of the power is held at the local levels of government, or the subunits of government. The United States started out as a confederation, right? You should remember this from both history and American national government. And what happened in our confederation? Why didn't it work? We had this at the beginning, and this is something that impacted marketing, how the regulatory environment impacted marketing. We had this confederation, so we had something called the Articles of Confederation, and what did that create in terms of problems for those of you who all have had American national government, right? Yeah, it became very difficult for the national government. They couldn't collect taxes. They could only ask the states. We had fought this war for independence. They could only ask the states for money. Well, if I just asked you, if the government just said, gee, would you pay your taxes? We'd kind of like you to, but we didn't have an enforcement mechanism, what would you say? No, I'm not paying my taxes, right? How many of you like taxes? It's one of the things that it's part of our social environment in the United States, right? We hate taxes. Why? We want to keep our own money, right? We're far more individualistic in this country than other places where they have a much higher tax rate. For example, most of Western Europe has a much higher progressive tax rate than we do in this country. So they couldn't collect taxes. There was no federal court system. So if you were a citizen of one state and you had contracts with somebody in another state, if you were a merchant and you had contracts with somebody in another state and they breached the contract, what did you have to do to collect on the contract? You had to do what? You had to go sue them in that state, right? There was no federal court system that could enforce these contracts. And so it made collection. What's the likelihood of somebody winning an award who's not a member of the, is not a citizen of the state against a citizen of that state? It goes down, right? So we developed the Constitution and we became a federal system, which is somewhere in between. In a federal system, some of the power, you have what's called dual sovereignty. Some of the power is held by the national government, and some of the power is held by the state government, and they operate within their own spheres of influence pretty autonomously, right? So you have In the unitary system, all power is derived from one government. So for example, in France, they have a unitary system. All the power is held by the federal government, and they give powers to subunits of government, but that which they give, they can take away. In a confederation, those subunits hold all of the power, and they can leave, right? A modern confederation would be something like the United Nations. We belong to the United Nations. It's made up of member states, right? But it doesn't, we can leave at any time if we wanted to. It doesn't have a lot of power. In a federal, you can't leave. We fought a war over this, right? Because the South tried to leave. And there's a case called Texas versus White, which settles that and says that once you come into the Union, you come into the Union, and that's all you get. But the states have their own power, and the federal government can't necessarily destroy the states, right? Let's think about the state of Oklahoma, for example. Culturally, is the Panhandle different than people in Oklahoma City? What are they more closely aligned to? They might be more closely aligned to Texas, right? Because if you're out in the Panhandle, it may be easier to get to Amarillo for your big city than it is to get to Oklahoma City, right? There are more sheep and pigs out in the Panhandle of Oklahoma than there are people. Corporate hog farming is really big, right? And so, could the federal government say, well, that should really be part of Texas? And just lop off our Panhandle and give it to Texas? No. Can't do that, right? Tulsa is different from Oklahoma City. Maybe they're more like what? Missouri, or Kansas City, Missouri, right? You can't just lob that off and give it to them. The states have their own power. So where they overlap, this is called concurrent powers. So we have the federal government, the state governments, and these powers in between are concurrent. What are some concurrent powers? Taxation, right? The state of Oklahoma can tax you, and the federal government taxes you. When you get your pay advice, how many of you have direct deposit? Almost all of you. Anybody actually get a live check from their employer? Wow. You still get an actual check that you have to take to the bank and deposit. Although technology has changed that, how has technology changed your ability to deposit? Yeah, you can take a picture of it and deposit it through your mobile app if you have if the bank does that, so that's a technological advance. They're allowing it to happen, so the bank regulators have said it's okay. So the power to tax. So for those of you who have a direct deposit, you get something that's called a pay advice from your employer, right? It may even look like a check. And if you get a live check, you get the same thing on it that has a breakdown of what? All the withholdings. And so you have federal withholding, state withholding, because Oklahoma has a state income tax. And then there's FICA, which is Social Security and Medicare, right, on there. And those are all broken out for you, right? So both the state and the feds can tax. Now, for most of our nation's history, most of the regulation of business occurred at the state level, right? If you wanted to start a business, you had to get state approval for things like, health codes and inspection, right? And the federal government didn't play a big role in it. And then what happens is three things occur that have led to the rise of what we might call the administrative state. One is the Great Depression occurred, and the states couldn't handle the problems that they faced on their own, and so they started putting these problems on the doorstep of the federal government. Now in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, it says that Congress has the ability and power to regulate interstate commerce. That's commerce among the states and between the states with foreign nations and the Indian tribes, right? So there's interstate commerce. This is the Interstate Commerce Clause in Article 1, Section 8. And then there is this idea of intra-state commerce. Intrastate commerce is commerce that takes place within the boundaries of a state, and that was left for the states to regulate, right? Now, as a result of the Great Depression, the states started saying, we're having these problems, and the Dust Bowl. How many of you have seen a movie called The Grapes of Wrath about Oklahoma? The Exodus from Oklahoma. You probably saw it in high school. You have to read the book.
Yes.
It's a depressing book, right? It's a depressing movie. And so a lot of people were migrating out of Oklahoma. The banks were foreclosing. There were all these problems, and we put them on the doorsteps of the federal government. So the Great Depression was one thing that led to the increase. So this is a test question. The three things that led to an increase in regulation by the federal government. The Great Depression, the Civil Rights Movement, and then technological advances. So you can see how these environmental forces interplay in this, right? So for most of the federal history, until about the 1930s, late 1920s and 1930s, we had this model of federalism that's talked a lot about in political science circles called the layer cake model, where you have the federal government on top and the state governments on the bottom. And the layer cake on the bottom was generally seen as being larger than the top layer, right? How many of you have seen layer cakes? Wedding cakes are generally layer cakes, right? And what are you supposed to do with the top layer of the wedding cake? You what? Yeah, you save it, you freeze it, and eat it when? On your first anniversary, right? So think of that. If you have a 2-layer wedding cake, the top layer you're going to take off, and it was small. That top layer of the wedding cake is smaller, right? Because the idea is that you save it, you freeze it. Anybody do that? Has anyone done that? It's not very good. After it's been frozen in your freezer for a year, I've never known anybody who said, oh, it was just absolutely excellent, right? But the bottom layer is what you're going to serve to your guests, right? So that's the bigger layer. And that was like the states. They were the bigger layer. They were the bigger players in regulation, right? And then as a result of the Great Depression, we start to move from this layer cake model to a marble cake model of federalism, where it's hard to determine where one part begins and another part ends, because we started seeing much more interplay between the states and the federal government. And this was largely as a result of the feds being able to regulate through the Interstate Commerce Clause. In 1954, in a case called Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, this social movement gained official legitimacy, right? So in 1954, the NAACP and a brilliant lawyer named Thurgood Marshall decided that the time was right to attack segregation head-on. They had attacked the periphery before that in various areas by saying it's not equal. And Oklahoma is one of these cases where they got the court to say, you're right, that wasn't equal. So who has the only official law school or the only state-sponsored law school in the state of Oklahoma? OU, right? TU is a private school, they're Presbyterian. Oklahoma City University is Methodist, right? Those are the two other law schools in the state. The only state school is OU, right? So they sued, the NAACP sued, because we didn't have a school for African Americans in law school, right? And they won. They got them to say that that was not equal, right? In 1954, they decided to take segregation head on and apply it to public education at the primary and secondary level, and argue that it was not ever separate but equal, right? That it's inherently unequal. And the cases originally argued under Chief Justice Fred Vinson. And after the case is argued, but before a decision is handed down, Vinson dies. At the time that it was argued, the votes were probably 5-4 to sustain the holding of Plessy versus Ferguson, which was a case that said that you could have separate but equal, right? And that didn't violate the Equal Protection Clause of the United States Constitution. Dwight David Eisenhower had promised Earl Warren that if Earl Warren wouldn't run for president against him, he would appoint him to the first seat open on the United States Supreme Court. And so when Fred Vinson dies, Eisenhower fulfills his promise to Warren, and he appoints Warren to the federal bench, and he had been a very popular governor of California, and he takes his seat, and one by one, he transforms. So now the vote is going to be 5-4 to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson, and one by one, he convinces these other justices that they need to vote with him, because this is such a monumental decision that they need to speak with a unanimous voice. And the last one that's a holdout is Stanley Reed. And he goes to Stanley Reed and he says to him, "Stan, you're all alone in this now. Do you really want to damage the reputation of the court by not voting?" So in 1954, we get the end of what we call de jure. Out. We get the end of de jure segregation in public accommodations. So that's D-U-J-U-R-A, which means all of these markers are sucky today. I wish they wouldn't put them back in the box if they're going down. But did that end it? So we ended de jure segregation in, as opposed to de facto segregation. We ended de jure segregation in public accommodations, but did that end segregation in the South? No, it didn't. Where did you still have segregation in the South? Businesses were still segregated, right? Everything else, other than schools, stayed the same, right? So movie theaters were still segregated, right? Lunch counters, restaurants, lodging establishments, right, were all segregated. Until 1964, when Lyndon Baines Johnson convinces Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He does this largely as a result of the fact that what happens to his predecessor. How does Lyndon Baines Johnson become president of the United States? Yeah, Kennedy is shot in Dallas, Texas. And Johnson feels a moral obligation to take up Kennedy's mantle as president and continue the civil rights movement, right? And so he does, and he gets the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 passed. I'm not sure that Kennedy could have done this. Johnson is a huge personality, and he had been Dean of the Senate. So he knew how the Senate works, how this body works, how to twist arms in order to get the passage of the Civil Rights Act through the United States Senate, where senators, a minority, can filibuster something to death, right, in the United States Senate. They can end debate. By the way, the Civil Rights Act in 1964 initially didn't contain a provision against sex, right? It just said that you couldn't discriminate on the basis of race, creed, or color. It didn't say anything about gender. And Representative Smith, who was from Virginia, inserted, because he thought it would detract from northern votes, pull northern votes away, he inserted an amendment on the House floor that said sex. So he became an unwitting hero of the women's movement, because then gender gets put into the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is challenged by businesses who did not want to desegregate, right? And there are two cases that you should know for the exam, as their test questions, that uphold the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And what they are is Heart of Atlanta Motel, versus the United States, 1964. And Katzenbach (1964) versus McClung. What Heart of Atlanta Motel said is, we're not a chain motel. We are wholly within the state of Georgia, and therefore that involves intra-state commerce as opposed to interstate commerce, and the federal government has overextended its reach by trying to regulate us, right? Because we're only within the state. We're not a national chain. We're not a national business. Wholly within the state of Georgia. And what do you think the court said to that in 1964?
And interstate commerce, your customers come from other states.
Right, exactly. When people travel, they have to have some place to stay, so you're involved in interstate commerce. Because you're not just serving customers of the state of Georgia, you're serving customers that come from out of state, and that involves a flow of money across state borders, right? And so that's interstate commerce. In Katzenbach versus McClung, it involved a restaurant named Ollie's Barbecue. They were off the beaten path. They were only frequented by locals. They did not allow for African Americans to purchase food from them in their dining room, but they could get takeaway at the back door of the business. And they said, we're not a national chain again, right? We're not serving people from outside of the state. We're a pretty local establishment that services people that come in. And the court said, oh, but where did your meat come from? Where did your ketchup packets come from? Oh, they were Heinz ketchup packets. That's manufactured in the Northeast. And so you are involved in interstate commerce, and it allows the federal government to then regulate. These two cases, what they've done and how they've impacted marketing is obviously, in the first instance, they had a great impact on the social environment that we face as marketers, right? In the year 1964, in that it totally changed the social dynamic of the South, right? And today, nobody would even question that, right? Those decisions. But they also impacted marketing in a broader sense, in that if you take the rationale of Katzenbach, which is you are involved in interstate commerce because you got your ketchup packets from someplace else. Is there anything that the federal government can't regulate now? There has been somewhat of a movement to take back and go back to devolution of the states in the courts, where they've started saying that the federal government's attempt to regulate is too attenuated to be sustained. And in particular, for example, one bill that was aimed at gun control said that it would be illegal and a federal crime to have a handgun within a schoolyard or a school zone, right? The idea was to eliminate what? School shootings, or make it a federal crime. And the court said,
Just by driving by with the gun in your pocket.
yes, I think that was the way the bill was written. And the court finally said that's too attenuated. And the way Congress got to regulating that and attempting to regulate it was they said, what? Well, who manufactures guns? A bunch of people. What are some of the most popular? Smith & Wesson, right?
Remington.
Obviously. Remington is another one. Winchester, right? All of these gun manufacturers, and they said they're involved in interstate commerce. And the court finally said that's too attenuated to regulate. But pretty much, if Congress can make fact-finding that something impacts the national economy in some way, they can regulate it. Now, they don't always choose to regulate it, but they can. What does this mean for marketers? In terms of our
Always have to be aware of the national, the federal government's like view of your products.
Okay, so that's one thing, is that now we have a lot more regulation. This technology is the third thing that's led to this marble cake model, right? We've had the Civil Rights Movement, the Great Depression, and now technology. Because for a long period of time, we operated with an idea of let the buyer beware, right? This is what lawyers call caveat emptor. Which means that if I can manufacture something and sell something to you, well, and you get hurt by it, well, that's just too bad, right? And that worked okay for a long period of time in Anglo-American jurisprudence when things were much simpler, right? But what can happen with technology and the stuff that we use today? It was pretty easy to judge the quality of stuff if you went back in time. Last time, or the time before that, I talked about, for example, my hometown, Guthrie, which is the largest historic preserve, right, in the nation. We have more homes and buildings and property on the National Register of Historic Places than anything else. And when Guthrie was founded, you know, most people, how did they get around? They got around with a horse. Could you evaluate a horse and the buggy? You can see kind of how well it's made, right? Then cars came along, and they were still pretty simple, and basically you could understand them. Could you possibly evaluate, for example, the safety of your car today?